Welcome back to The Fix with me, Karima Brown. Now, following the Cabinet Lekgotla, which precedes the State of the Nation address to be delivered later this month, most South Africans want to know what the government plans to do about growing the economy, creating jobs, and delivering basic services to communities. To help me look ahead to what we can expect from the State of the Nation address, I'm joined by an expert panel. We've got a Vice-Chancellor at Wits University, Professor Habib. We've also got a gender activist and former director at Action Aid, Fatima Shabodien, and Professor of Economics at the University of Johannesburg, Fiona Tregenna. Now, before we start unpacking the topic, let's first hear from the Minister in the Presidency, Mr. Jackson Mthembu, on what the President should be focusing on the State of the Nation, before he addresses the State of the Nation, rather. And this was, of course, prior to the Lekgotla taking place. Let's have a listen.
What do we need to do to ensure and build an ethical, capable state, amongst others? Because we are the government. Where are the gaps in our SOEs, in the structures of government, at national level, at provincial level, at the municipalities? What is it that we need to do to arrest the capacities that seem not to be there in many of our state-owned entities and, of course, in government broadly? So that is one area in keeping with the 7 priorities. But again, the second equally important area is deepening economic growth and attracting investment. If we are to deal with the many crises we have in our country, it will be very important that we identify the sectors that will be able to create the necessary growth that we need so that we again build the jobs and create the jobs that our young people need.
That was, of course, Minister in the Presidency, Mr. Jackson Mthembu, laying out the priorities of the government. Now, we know President Ramaphosa is having to do a massive juggling act. Professor Habib, let me start with you. If you were to draw up the to-do list for SONA, what would be topping that to-do list?
So I think some of what Jackson touches on is actually quite important. But I think that the real problem is that we're in a serious moment in this country. People feel that we're in a crisis, and they feel that government is not leading. They feel, frankly, that the president is not demonstrating decisive leadership. So what I think you need to do in this State of the Nation address is both articulate hope and create a sense of decisiveness. And it seems to me that that's missing. In a lot of ways, people are saying the president playing the long game. But if you play a long game, you have to have short-term victories. Otherwise, no long game happens. And so if I was that would be the first thing. And he needs to be decisive and says, we are in trouble. Here's the problems around it. And here's what I'm going to do. The first I would suggest, and Fiona can talk about this, is actually the policies of the Radical Economic Transformation Group are not feasible. But neither are the conservative agendas of the Institute of Race Relations.
Hold that thought.
Here's what we're going to do.
Hold that thought right there, Adam, and let me bring in Fiona, Professor of Economics at the University of Johannesburg. Do we need a middle ground to debate or to rather implement economic policy? Are you in agreement with Adam that the extremes doesn't take us anywhere?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily frame it in terms of a middle ground, but I think there's a clear sense that the country is ready to hear something new. It can't be business as usual. The challenges are so vast that incremental policy changes will at best yield incremental changes in outcomes, and that won't take us to where we need to go. So I think in terms of framing the priorities, economic priorities for the State of the Nation address, I always feel that presidents face a bit of a catch-22 in terms of how to pitch it, because if you focus too much on broad, big ideas, people say, well, where's the details? Yeah. And if you get in the nitty-gritties of technical details, as some former State of the Nation addresses have done, people say, well, where's the big thinking? So I guess it's a question of balancing. There's got to be a sense that there's something different. There's big ideas which are being put forward. But I think in particular areas of crisis, there's also got to be specific proposals which are implementable with timeframes and that are able to convince people, investors and ordinary citizens, that things are going to change in terms of growth, unemployment and so on.
Fatima, I saw you nodding your head when both speakers were talking. Are you in agreement with them?
Absolute agreement. I think in our country there's a sense of crisis. All of us can see the crisis playing itself out, and it manifests in the livelihoods, especially of the poor. And we are tired of the slogans. I think we want a SONA without platitudes. We want to see concrete proposals of actions on how we get out of the crisis. If we look at the statement that came out of the Lekgotla, I think we were all just depressed after it, because there was not a single new idea coming out of that. We want to see the plan that takes us from where we are now to where we want to be as a nation.
Adam, how do you combine giving people hope with very granular practical details around, let's say, what to do with a student that comes out of a Tivet college that has just studied boilermaking and now needs to get a job?
So here's what I think has to happen. So for instance, yes, you need to get the balance right, but I can tell you now that if you don't put on the agenda very firmly that for wages, for instance, with unions, you're going to have it inflation linked for at least 3 years. You're never going to win that without saying the top 50 CEOs don't take an increase for 3 years. I think you're going to have to say that, and you're going to have to win the political space for that. The second thing I think you're going to say, look, in 3 or 4 or 5, 6 sectors, we're going to grow, and we're going to grow this. We're going to grow areas, and we're going to get the right balance. But here's the worry about investment. You want investment. Investors, I speak to them, are freaked out by 3 things. They freaked out about the political instability. So when you saw those pictures of students burning things, they freaked out about it. They freaked out about violent strikes. The president has to send out a very strong signal that we're going to take action. Jackson spoke about corruption and capacity in the state. They freaked out by the fact that every time they have to speak to somebody, somebody is asking them for a bribe. Now, you need action in those areas, and he has to send a message that says, we're coming after you. And frankly, we're going to lock you up. And if that message doesn't go out, you can talk to investors about as much as you want. They're not going to come because they don't trust the system.
Let's get to the economy. We've been in trouble because our strategies are wrong, because we followed policies that has not yielded results, but we're also in trouble because of corruption. So from an economics point of view, Fiona, what should be the priority for the president to communicate to the country? And this is taking into consideration from workers to your CEOs to your foreign investors.
Well, I suppose in broad terms, there needs to be a focus on the one hand on growth, which is pathetic at the moment. And without growth, it's almost impossible to deliver on anything else. And then secondly, on the triple challenges, unemployment, inequality, poverty. And these are all interrelated. As I've said, without growth, you can't sustainably address unemployment. Without addressing unemployment, you can't bring down inequality and so on. So I think in broad terms, that's what it needs to be framed around. And then more specifically, I guess, some of the issues, firstly, I would mention energy. Certainty of electricity supply is just such a basic requirement, let alone for a 21st century economy, thinking about the 4-hour or whatever, even the 20th century economy. Unless you've got certainty of electricity supply, it's so important, not just for production, but just for the mood in the country of businesses, households, and so on. So it's sorting out Eskom, which is obviously a major challenge, but it really can't be avoided. And then I think another aspect linked to energy is the green transition and the just transition. Given the fact that we don't even have enough energy supply, it's really a no-brainer to increase the supply of renewable energy and to try and link job creation, for example, to that. So it's not just about mitigating job losses, but to say, how can we create large-scale jobs linked to this? So, for example, manufacturing of products linked to the green transition and so on, and getting in on that before we left behind internationally. State-owned enterprises more broadly than Eskom, obviously these need to play a central role in the economy, in growth and job creation and transformation, and if they're not functioning, our hands will be very much tied. Macroeconomic policy, in my view, hasn't been as effective as it could. in terms of supporting job creation. And if we continue with pretty much the same macroeconomic policy as we've been implementing, I don't think we're going to change anything.
Fatima, you're shaking your head around the statement about continuing with the same macroeconomic policy, hoping for different outcomes. Now, heterodox economists have argued austerity for a long time. We saw recently the Reserve Bank governor taking a different stance. Many people see that as a signal of hope that there is fresh thinking about how to put cash in the hands of ordinary citizens so that the economy can be stimulated. But we're also talking about an impossible public wage bill. How does the state balance that wage bill but continue to put money into the hands of ordinary people so that there is going to be stimulus from within?
I think we need to have a holistic conversation about austerity. So there's no disagreement that the state is bloated. We see from the numbers in ESCOM. But I think all across the world it shows that when governments implement World Bank kinds of austerity policies, it doesn't help anybody, it doesn't reduce inequality, it doesn't actually stimulate growth. So the reality is we must recognize that in this economic crisis, people are differently affected. And the priority must be to safeguard the livelihoods of the poor at this stage. So we've already made commitments about the NHI, about fees to university students. Now we've also committed to financing the National Strategy Plan on gender-based violence. So I think while it's tempting to want to cut all of those, we must agree on the minimums that we're going to protect to ensure that poor people don't fall further into destitution in this period of economic uncertainty.
Adam, how do you protect the poor when you have a business community that says we actually need everything to be privatized, and that is going to be the magic elixir that's going to fix whatever is ailing the South African economy?
So you see, the reason that the business community or conservative economic thinkers can have sway is because you're not leading on this. You have to lead the conversation. And that's what the role of a president is. You say the radical economic transfer is not going to work for A, B, C, and D, including the fact that you'd have no state capacity. But actually, if you do it this way, you're going to drive inequality and further socially polarize. Here's the framework within which we're leading. And that's why I carry on saying you've got to define the parameters. It's very clear, for me anyway, that inflation-linked wages for the next 3 years is important. That doesn't mean austerity, because what you're still saying is we're going to move money not only to the people who are earning wages, but to the people who are in the precariat, who are not earning wages. And we're going to put that in the social wage, we're going to put it in health, we're going to put it in education, and we're going to create a set of circumstances there. That's what you need to do. What you need to do is get money out of narrowly the wage area and investments in the social wage that start moving the economy and moving society, thereby creating hope. That's the argument that I think you make.
Fiona, there's often the argument that the state needs to take a leading role in the economy, and the South African state isn't afraid of doing that. It's the capacity and the corruption that comes to bear in that. But we've just seen, for example, the appointment of the new Tiger brand CEO, the same person that was at the heart of the price-fixing scandal. So the private sector isn't the poster girl or boy for good management either. So we've got, in some instances, a very corrupt state sector which have monopolies, and a very highly concentrated private sector with corrupt practices. I mean, that's a very difficult position for Cyril Ramaphosa to be in, isn't it?
Absolutely, Karima, and I think you're absolutely correct in pointing out that the private sector also has corruption, lack of skills, and so on. It's obviously a priority to build capacity within the state. Without that, the state cannot be effective in its role in the economy or in governance more broadly. But capacity is also built in part by doing. So through implementing projects, making mistakes, obviously, hopefully not catastrophic mistakes, but you learn, you build skills, you build competencies. So I don't think you can just stand back and say, well, until we've got an ideal state, we don't implement policies. The state has to play a more fundamental role in the economy. But it's really a priority, I think, to enhance the productivity of spending. In my view, we need a stimulus package, We need to spend more on infrastructure and so on. But that spending has got to be as productive as possible. Otherwise, you're incurring debt that you can't repay. But if you borrow and you finance that, but the spending is productive, it not only meets people's basic needs, but also raises the growth rates, then it's justifiable. So it's about macro measures to enhance the productivity of spending, as well as more broadly seeing where in the economy that should be directed.
Adam?
So yeah, I'll give you an example. Public institutions can work, right? And I don't want to kind of get involved in Wits, but look, in 2013, we were producing 6,000 graduates. In 2019, we were producing 9,500. In 2013, we were producing 1,300. In 2019, we were producing 2,000 research publications. That can work. We had 9,800 postgraduates, now we have 15,000. Now, this is not a Wits story. You go to UJ, there's a similar kind of... There are public institutions that work. They work when you focus on the big issues. Yes, you make mistakes, but you learn from those mistakes. You invest in the right things, and what you provide is strategic leadership. For me, state leadership, what I'm looking for now from the president is not state leadership. I want him to politically lead, to set up the parameters of the debate, to create hope, to give confidence that those who are corrupt, both in the private and public sector, will be arrested, that we will stare down those who are not part of the strategic agenda. That's what you want at this historical moment.
Fatima, a lot of people will argue it's pointless to have a deeply ideological debate when we can't even roll out Bernardo. So how do we take doing things differently, but doing them effectively, so that, for example, when you make commitments at a summit to deal with gender-based violence, the rape kits actually get to the police station, the police officers have the adequate training, and the person coming in has a chance of actually receiving and experiencing justice?
Look, for me, at the heart of it is, what we are not talking about is the leadership crisis in our country. It would be wonderful for me to turn on the TV and actually hear Cyril Ramaphosa acknowledge there to be a leadership crisis, a lack of courage, a lack of new ideas. We're in the moment of globalization. The crisis that we're experiencing is not unique. So we can look around the world and see what other countries have done. There's been some successes, some failures, but we actually don't have to make the same mistakes. So that's the one thing. And then we need a vision on how to replace our leadership. The people who are ruling our country at the moment are the very people who brought us to the brink of this crisis. They do not have the political imagination, integrity, or political commitment to actually lead us out of it. So I think we need an honest conversation, and it's very difficult to take Cyril Ramaphosa seriously when they continue denying the viciousness of the ANC factional battles, because it's not the political party conversation, it is a battle that's affecting all of our livelihoods. I do want to respond though to both Fiona and Adam and talk about universities and the corporate sector. So I think the framing is not that the corporate sector is also implicated in corruption, that the very center of it. I think we must recognize that that is what capital is supposed to do, is what it's done in South Africa and what it's done everywhere. So today our conversation is focused on our president and our government, but I think we must look to all of the institutions in our societies. So what is the role of universities in bringing us out of this crisis? They are highly subsidized by all of us. You look at Rhodes University, you look at the water crisis in Grahamstown. Why is it that all that scientific brains at one institution cannot practically come to the table and say, this will be our contribution to solving a massive crisis in the area right where the university is located? We're not seeing universities come to the table in a practical way in leading us out of this crisis.
Adam, there is a direct challenge. We have, for example, a water crisis. Where are our researchers at our universities? How geared are the people who are studying PhDs to dealing with the problems of our economy and of our country, rather than doing them for very narrow, esoteric purposes?
So, firstly, 75–80% of our research in the society is actually of an applied kind. This is something that, this is very little esoteric research or blue sky research happens here. Go look at economics departments and see the kinds of stuff. I agree with you, by the way. I think the problem in Rhodes is not an issue of why aren't we? It's also the biggest employer in Grahamstown. I would like to see roads play a more fundamental role in the management of that municipality. That's not prevented. That's prevented by legislation, by the local political elite. They don't want all of that. I think the issue of Grahamstown is resolvable, and the reason it's not resolvable because of decisive political leadership that is coming from the political system.
Okay.
That's the point. But I do think we can do more. But I think, don't expect, universities are not going to be producing panados. What they do is produce human beings. What happens is there's a period of mentorship that has to happen, that comes out for this, and we need to recognize.
Okay, I'm going to give Fiona the final word. Fiona, you the economist at the table. What is the one economic priority that Cyril Ramaphosa cannot afford to miss at SONA?
Well, let me combine it in two in one and say inclusive growth. In a way, it's obvious. But more specifically, energy. If I had to pick one, energy.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. Fiona, Adam, Fatima, thank you so very much for joining me here on The Fix. Next up, we take a look at the stories making headlines in the weekend newspapers. Stay with us.
Thank you, chaps.
Thank you very much.